Good afternoon, explorers, and welcome back to another episode of the Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Ty, and I'm coming to you from the Aquarium of the Pacific here in Long Beach, California. And today we're going to be exploring one really amazing animal that we'll get to in just a bit. But along our journey today, if you would like to join along live with us, I'm going to have my friend Tina, who's working all the magic that you'll see behind me. She's going to throw up a number right here below me, and that number is 562-286-1838. And you can text that number if you'd like to share any of your observations or if you have questions. We'd be more than happy to answer them live during our program today. Now, if you're watching this after and you would still like you still have some questions that you thought of, please feel free to use the email down below at live@lbaop.org, and we'll be sure to get back to you as soon as we can. Now, you don't have to text that number if you don't want to. If you happen to also be watching with somebody, some family or friends, you can also share along with them. But sharing is a big part of what it means to be a scientist. And today we're all going to be scientists together. Because scientists, what we do is we are curious about the world around us. So today we're going to be exploring some ocean habitats like you see behind me. And then we're going to ask some questions, explore further together, and then share what we've learned. And hopefully we'll walk away with some new knowledge about a really amazing animal. So let's go ahead and highlight the animal that we're going to be talking about today. So the animal that we're going to be exploring is a very, very cute animal. Maybe you're familiar with it. I'll see if my friend Tina can throw up a picture of our star today, and that is this adorable animal here. Do you recognize this animal? This is the sea otter. So our program today is going to be talking all about the sea otter because there's much more to them than just a cute face, and that's what we're going to find out today. Now, before we dive into this adorable animal and learn all about it, we need to talk about where it lives. And so we're going to go ahead and go back because that place that I was just in is actually one of the homes where you'll be able to find sea otters. So take a look behind me here. Do you recognize this habitat? Maybe if you've watched some previous episodes, you've learned a little bit about this ocean habitat before. Now, remember when we're thinking about the word habitat, we're just thinking about the home, right? Where the animal lives. Now, on land, we have a whole bunch of different kinds of habitats, like the Arctic, the desert, the rainforest, and in each of those, you're going to find different animals. And that's because animals have what we call adaptations. Adaptations are something that an animal has on its body, something that it's born with to help them to survive in their habitat. Now, in the case of the sea otter, we're going to explore what adaptations they have to survive here in the kelp forest. But before we know about that, we need to explore their habitat so we know what are some of the challenges that an otter is going to have to deal with. So why don't we start by warming up our brains and making some observations about this habitat. So I'll step off to the side here and just take a minute to take a close look at habitat the kelp forest. Now, like I said, if you'd like to text in your observations, if you notice something that really stands out to you, feel free to use that number at the bottom and text us live. And my friend Tina can pass along questions or any observations that you have. All right, so like I said, let's just take a couple seconds to observe this habitat. What are some things that you notice? Now, when we're thinking about things to notice, it can be anything, right? What first might stand out to you, what stands out to me is that there's definitely lots of fish swimming around, right? In almost all parts of this. So it looks like there's a lot of animals that live in this place too. Now, we don't quite see any otters yet, and that's because this exhibit that we're looking at is actually one from here at the aquarium. We don't have otters in this one, but these are some of the animals that would be living with otters. Okay, so I'm seeing lots of different fish, but what if we skip past the fish and we look at the habitat itself? Look at some of those non-living things. Is there anything that you notice now? Well, I notice down here and over here, there are some big rocks. And actually, if you look all the way around the background, you're going to see that it's rocky too. Now, at first, you might think, why do we care about rocks? And how does that possibly connect to sea otters? But it all does. And you'll see, we'll build these pieces together. Everything will be connected. Now, in the case of the rock, why we care about these things is because that is an attachment point for all of this. So we call this place the kelp forest because, well, it looks like a rainforest that's underwater. Kelp is this stuff that you're seeing here. Kelp is a type of seaweed, right? And so we're going to need to have all of this kelp or seaweed because it's going to play an important role in the habitat. Can you think of any ways that animals might need kelp? Well, what do you think? What might be some ways that animals are going to interact with kelp, because kelp is really important. Now, maybe as you've been watching, right, earlier when we saw lots of fish, you'll probably see them sort of swimming in and around the kelp. Any ideas why they might do that? Well, if you were thinking maybe as a way to hide, you'd be correct. Kelp provides a great hiding spot for lots of different animals, especially little fish. So oftentimes, if you have some tiny fish, some baby fish that are still growing up, the kelp forest provides a great safe place to hide. Any other things that you think could be useful as far as how animals are going to use this kelp? Maybe you thought of something like food. And if you thought of food, you also would be correct. Now, there are some animals, some that we'll explore today, that really love eating kelp. And so that's why we say it's so important, because it sort of builds the home and it also provides food for some animals too. Now, believe it or not, kelp even has some benefits for us humans here on land, because kelp is a type of algae. And so even though it looks a whole lot like a plant, it's actually technically not a plant. But even though it's a little bit different, it still sort of behaves like a plant. And what I mean by that is plants on land are going to use the sun to get their energy for photosynthesis. Kelp here underwater is going to do the same thing. And so because of that, kelp, when it's really healthy, you can see can grow tall up towards the sun. And when it does that, it's making energy and then therefore is producing oxygen too. And so even some of the breaths that we take here on land, in fact, most of the breaths that we take here on land are actually thanks to the ocean for lots of different things like kelp, right? Not just kelp, but kelp is one of the things that helps to give us some of the oxygen that we breathe on air. Now, it also helps to protect our coastline too. And so kelp, really, really important. And so now we're going to need to connect this kelp forest to that amazing otter, or the amazing animal, the sea otter. So why don't we switch gears and look at the otter and see if we can point out any adaptations on there, right? So kelp, the kelp forest, as you saw, it's a great place to hide, to blend in for a lot of animals. Now, something that I didn't mention is how the kelp forest feels. Now, kelp forest is also the habitat that we have off of our coast here in Southern California. And so I've been lucky enough to go down and explore in the kelp forest. And one thing I will tell you, when you go down into the kelp forest, it is very, very cold, okay? So it's really, really cold. For us, we have to wear these big suits when we go diving in the kelp forest. Now, an otter is not going to be able to put on an extra suit, but why don't we think about that? Take a moment to observe this otter and think about what might be some adaptations to deal with the cold. Let's see. Here's another awesome video of an otter. Why don't I step off so we can fully appreciate it while you try and make some observations? What are some ways that a sea otter would stay warm in the kelp forest? Now, maybe you're noticing that all over the body of these adorable sea otters is that fur. Now, fur is a great way for these animals to stay warm. Sea otters are a type of mammal. Mammals, just like us, means that we have some things in common. One of the things is that we breathe air. And so even you can see the sea otter is actually not in the water right now, up on land eating some snacks, right? Because they're going to actually have to come up to the surface, and they actually spend a lot of time at the surface because they're breathing air like us. But also, like most mammals in the ocean, marine mammals like whales and dolphins and seals and sea lions, they have a thick layer of blubber or fat that helps to keep them warm. Sea otters, on the other hand, as the smallest marine mammal, don't have any of that blubber. But instead, that fur coat that we're talking about now is actually the thickest, most dense fur of any animal on the planet, right? So if you've ever wondered, what is the fluffiest animal? Well, the answer is this adorable animal right here. Okay, so that fur, right, super, super thick. In fact, in just a small area, well, actually, I brought a little sample. Why don't we take a look? Let me have my friend Tina bring us over to our document camera, because I want to show you just how thick that fur is. Now you can see that right here we have a little tiny square, and this symbolizes a square inch. So if you make a sort of circle with your thumb and finger, you'll see that's about a square inch. And in just this little patch right here, sea otters can have over 600,000 hairs. That is a huge number. To put that in perspective, that's like if you take 10 human heads and you take all the hair and shove it into just one small spot like that, that's how thick their fur is. So sea otters, really thick fur. Now, there's actually another ability that they have in order to stay warm in the kelp forest, and we were seeing it in that video. What was going on? Why don't we go back? What is the sea otter doing in this video? Can you tell? It's enjoying some snacks, right? Now, when sea otters eat, of course, it is very adorable, but this diet is actually very important to staying warm. Because they lack that blubber, they also need some other tricks to make sure that they stay warm. And so we say that sea otters have a metabolic furnace. What that means is they're going to eat a lot and they're going to burn all those calories, and so that's going to constantly keep them generating heat so that they can stay warm. Now, sea otters need to eat a lot in order to do this. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot. For sea otters, they need to eat between 20 and 30% of their body weight every single day. Now, to put that in perspective, that's like if a human weighs 100 pounds, you would need to eat 100 quarter-pound cheeseburgers every single day. That's a lot of food, right? So even though these animals are small and adorable, well, small-ish and adorable, they're going to eat a ton of food. Because by doing that, they're going to be constantly, like I said, burning those calories, keeping themselves warm, and then using that fur coat on the outside to trap that heat, to keep it on them so that even though they spend their whole time in those cold kelp forest waters, it allows them to stay nice and warm. So, sea otters, why don't we think about some of the things that they're like to eat? If you're looking closely here, right, you can maybe pick out what they're eating in this video. These are going to be some little shrimps. But there's many more things that sea otters are going to eat too. Why don't we take a look over here at my camera, and I'll show you a little bit of what the teeth look like on a sea otter, and then we'll check out some other pictures too. All right, so let's look over here really quick, and what I can show you here, this is a replica of a sea otter skull. So it's not a real one, but it helps us to get an idea about what a sea otter skull looks like. And Tina has told me that we have some observations, so we'll talk about, if you just text it in, we'll talk about those next as well. So one of the things that we saw already that it was eating was shrimp. Now take a look here at this skull, this model skull of a sea otter. What are some things that you notice? Anything standing out to you? I'll move it around so you can sort of see. Here's the side view. Here's where the mouth is. Here's the underside. And there's their smile. Anything standing out to you? Well, I'll tell you, for me right now, something that stands out is these huge teeth, right? So even though the skull isn't very big, you can see those teeth are huge and very strong too. So sea otters are able to eat through some of these things like shrimp, where, for example, if you at home have ever eaten any shrimp before, you know that we have to peel off that outside, right? We have to peel off that exoskeleton. And so for sea otters, though, they're going to use some of that big teeth to break through some of those things. Now, can you think of any other food items that the sea otters would need to break through, maybe using those teeth? Besides shrimp, any other things you think they might like to eat? Perhaps some other crunchy things from the ocean. Because one thing I will tell you is that many times if you think, well, this animal is living in the kelp forest, we saw all of those fish earlier, why isn't the sea otter eating all those fish? Well, sea otters don't really like to eat fish. Instead, because, well, for one, they're not really fast enough to catch them, right? So they're not really going to be eating fish. Instead, they're going to look for some of these slower moving things down at the bottom of the kelp forest. Shrimp might be an example of something, but can you think of any others? Things that would live down at the bottom in some hard shells? Well, maybe if you said something like, it could be something like clams, or maybe even something like crabs, or maybe even something like sea snails, or maybe even things like sea stars. All of these things sea otters will love to eat. Okay, so these are some items that these sea otters are going to eat, but there's still one food item that is one of their favorites that we haven't really touched on yet. Now, Tina has told me that someone had a question about if a sea otter has a shellfish allergy because maybe you know somebody who might. Well, for sea otters, that's pretty much their whole diet. So they're not really going to have that same issue because shellfish are sort of the only things that they're going to be eating, right? Because, like we mentioned, even fish is not something that's typically on their diet. They're really going to be looking for these things like snails and clams, shrimps and crabs, things like that, hard shells that they can break through. Now, teeth is one way they can get through, but they also can use tools. Someone else was asking, are sea otters smart? And the answer is yes, they can be pretty smart. They're one of the few animals out in the ocean that use tools. So if they find something that lives in one of these hard shells, like a clam or a crab, they can actually take another shell or a rock and then use it to break through that outer layer, use those strong teeth too, and that's how they can eat all of these different animals. Now, but like I said, there's still one animal that that sea otters love to eat that we haven't looked at yet. So why don't we take a peek at one of their favorite food items called the sea urchin. I'm going to have my friend Tina pull up a sea urchin, and they look something like this. Now, what do you notice about the sea urchin? Is there anything that stands out to you? Well, I notice for sure that this thing has a lot of spikes, right? Its whole body is surrounded, right? So if I was to touch this, I would imagine could be pretty sharp maybe. Maybe it's pretty spiny. Any ideas why an urchin has all these spines? How would spines help an urchin to survive in the ocean? Well, if you're thinking maybe to protect itself, you're right. Because imagine you're a fish swimming around and you see something that looks like this. Is that probably going to be your first choice of food? Probably not, right? And so most animals are going to stay away from eating sea urchins because breaking through those spines is just too much work. Sea otters, however, using those teeth and tools, can break through these spines of a sea urchin, and it becomes one of their favorite foods. Now, this interaction with sea urchins is super important, right? Because if not many things can eat urchins, well, then there lies a problem. But why? What is the problem with having sea urchins around? Well, in this picture, this sea urchin is actually munching on something. Can you tell? Think back to the habitat that we were looking at, the kelp forest. Sea urchins love to eat kelp, right? So sea urchins, they kind of crawl along the bottom of the kelp forest using their spikes to protect themselves. Their mouth is on the underside, so you can't even really see it here. But what they do is they graze or they scrape things off of the rocks, including kelp. Now, let's connect these pieces together and think about where that problem might be. So let's go over to my document camera real quick, and we'll put together a really quick drawing so we can see how these different pieces connect. Now remember, I told you everything is connected, including those rocks we saw earlier, right? So I'm going to build a little mini kelp forest here, right? These are my rocks, and on the rocks, we saw that there was lots and lots of that kelp. Now, kelp actually attaches itself to the rocks with a special sort of part of its body called the holdfast, which looks like this. Now, plants on land have roots to dig into the sand to keep themselves in place. Kelp has holdfast, which is this really, as you can see, complicated net that kind of looks like roots too, but that's what keeps it attached. So if we add that kelp holdfast down at the bottom, kelp is going to be standing up towards the sun because they want to use that sun for their energy, right? So I'll draw some kelp here. It's kind of floating around, right? We have to get some water in there too, right? We have to know that we're underneath. Let's zoom out just a little bit. Right? Okay, but here is where an issue lies, right? So if we draw our little urchin friend, I'll draw a purple one like we were looking at earlier. Urchins, like I said, love to eat kelp. And so they're going to be munching on all of the kelp, including the holdfast, that part at the bottom. Now, what happens is if they eat this kelp, kelp can float away. And that's because kelp has these sort of little, I'll show you some fake kelp here, but you'll be able to see, has these sort of little air bladders, we'll call them, that allow the kelp to float up towards the top. Now, if a sea urchin eats away at that part on the bottom, then the kelp can go flying away. Now think back, right? Earlier we thought about how these animals rely on kelp, all those fish we saw. If you have no kelp, well, you've lost the home, right? And so that's where sea otters come in handy, because of the way that they're going to munch on these otters. Now, why don't I draw a little otter towards the top? It's probably not going to be a very good drawing, but pretend that this little friend up here at the top is going to be my sea otter. He's very happy up here, right? So imagine my little sea otter up at the top. It's going to be eating those sea otter or the sea urchins. Now, what we're actually doing here is creating something called a food chain. Maybe you've learned about those before. Food chains just show you, well, who eats who. Now, in the case of the kelp, do you remember what is it using to get its energy? The sun. So what we draw is the energy going from the sun to the kelp, and if an urchin is going to eat the kelp, then we say, well, the energy from the kelp is going towards the sea urchin. They're munching on that kelp. And then who's going to eat the urchins? The sea otter is. Now, when you have otters here in the kelp forest, we get what we think of as a balance, right? Because if they're eating urchins, they keep their numbers down so that they don't overeat the kelp. But now we need to talk about the story of sea otters and what has happened to them. Now, think back. One of the adaptations we looked at earlier was that thick fur, right? That fur that helps them to stay warm out in the kelp forest. Now, unfortunately, this fur got them into a bit of trouble a few hundred years ago. So in the 1700s, 1800s, and even early 1900s, sea otters were hunted for that fur. This was at a time before humans used a lot of fake fur like we do now. And so once humans found out how thick their fur is, we started hunting them to use for clothing. Now, unfortunately, this hunting was to very high levels, and we almost completely drove otters to extinction. In fact, in Southern California, right, we used to have them, but we no longer really do. They used to exist in a population of the tens of thousands, all the way in the Pacific Ocean from here down to Baja California, all the way around to the other side of the Pacific. But once they were hunted, there was really only 3 sort of small groups that were left. One of them is in Central California, near Monterey Bay, San Francisco, a little bit further north than where we are now. At its lowest point, there was less than 50 of these otters left in California. We almost completely lost them, which is sad, right? We don't want to lose otters, not just because they're cute, but because of how important they are. We need otters to eat animals like sea urchins in order to keep their populations in check. Because if they don't, right, if we look at our drawing here, if we remove our sea otter, right, if we take it out, let me grab my little eraser, right, if we remove our otter, we no longer have things eating urchins. Well, what's left? Urchins get to just go free and eat all of this kelp, right? Nothing is there to stop them. And if urchins overeat the kelp, well, then there's no more kelp for all the other animals that rely on it. Maybe we can take a look at what that looks like. I don't know if maybe Tina can take a look and see if we have any videos or pictures of what this habitat can look like if urchins are left unchecked, right? So that's where the relationship, the importance of the sea otters comes from. That huge diet that helps them stay warm also helps to keep the ecosystem healthy because all these different pieces are connected. Now, while Tina sees if she can find it, if not, no big deal. But really what you got to think about is that the kelp, if it's completely gone, we lose all those benefits. We lose the shelter. We lose the food for other animals. And so the absence of otters doesn't mean that there's just no otters. It can mean complete changes for the ecosystem, right? So Tina looks like I was able to find a picture or video about what it looks like. So why don't we take a look and see what does that look like if we remove otters? How can the habitat change from the healthy kelp forest over to something that looks a bit like this, right? So take a look. What's missing here? Or what is there a lot of, right? Take a look. All the way around this rocky reef. Well, what is there a lot of? Urchins, right? Urchins sort of as far as the eye can see all around this reef. But do you see any kelp? No, right? They've overgrazed. They've eaten all that kelp. But do you even see any fish or other animals? Not really, right? And so that's why we say otters are so important. Their presence in the kelp forest means that it actually stays healthier for everything else, right? So now we got to think about, well, what can we do, right? We now know that otters are super important. How can we protect them? Well, Thankfully, otters are no longer hunted for their fur, which is great, right? We've removed the thing that started their decline in the first place. And so now in Central California, there's closer to about 3,000 of them. Now, 3,000 is much better than 50, but it is still nowhere near their historic numbers, right? And so there's still more things that we can do. Now, one of the coolest things that's going on here at the Aquarium of the Pacific to help bring back these sea otters is something called the Sea Otter Surrogacy Program. Why don't we flip back to a picture, or maybe we can look at some otters out in the wild if we have some, and maybe we can take a peek at them. But one of the things, like I said, this program is called the Sea Otter Surrogacy Program. Let's talk about how that works. Well, earlier I mentioned that sea otters are mammals, just like you and I. And so many mammals are going to learn skills to survive from their mom, right? Sea otters are not born with the sort of instincts to be able to keep themselves alive. They learn a lot of it from their mom, who takes care of them in the first year or so of their life. And so, unfortunately, out in the ocean, there can be instances where we have a stranding, or you find what we call an orphan pup, meaning that a tiny otter pup has been separated from its mom. Now look at just how adorable they are when they're babies. You thought they couldn't get any cuter? They definitely can, right? And so sometimes these otters, if they're babies, can get separated from their mom. And that can mean big trouble, because if an otter doesn't have its mom to take care of it, then it's really unlikely to survive out in the ocean, because they don't know how to forage for food, how to, do all that gathering that we were talking about of all the different food it likes to eat. They also don't learn how to keep their fur clean, because they need to make sure their fur is groomed so that it can keep them nice and warm, right? And so the program, the Sea Otter Surrogacy Program, what it does is it actually brings in orphan pups, so we rescue them from the wild, and in partnership with the Monterey Bay Aquarium up in Monterey Bay, we've worked to actually pair these baby otters with an adult otter. Now, that seems kind of weird, right? Why wouldn't we just take care of it? We can give them all the food that they need and then put them back out in the ocean, right? Well, what we found is that if you try to raise them that way, where humans are involved, and then you put them back out in the ocean, they don't really do that well, because they still haven't picked up the skills that they need. And sometimes they even look for people, right? Once they're back out in the ocean, they see people, on kayaks or surfing and things, and they see people and they think that's my food source, right? We don't want them to do that. We want them to learn how to be an otter. And so the surrogacy program actually pairs them with a non-releasable exhibit otter. And so here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, we have some adult female otters who are amazing moms, where they take in these rescue pups, they raise them like their own, and they teach them all the skills that they need to do. And so the human part is sort of removed. We want to try and minimize human contact with them so that they can learn how to be an otter from an otter. And what we found is that when you do that and they build these skills, they learn how to feed, they learn how to groom themselves, they do much better when they're released back out into the ocean. And so that's a really amazing program that's going on here at the Aquarium of the Pacific that was pioneered by the Monterey Bay Aquarium, like I said, up in Monterey Bay. And so it's been a great partnership to help rescue some of these orphan pups, teach them the things that they need to do, and then they can be put out into the ocean to thrive and help boost those numbers. And so the hope is that as we continue to rescue and release these otters back out into the ocean, and as we continue to also protect their habitats, we'll eventually see otters start to expand and continue to grow in their numbers. Because not only do we need to focus on the otters, but it's important to think about their home as well, right? That kelp forest that we've been exploring today is a coastal ecosystem, meaning it's found right off of the land, right? And so humans can have a big impact on this place too. Sometimes, unfortunately, things like pollution can get washed in, right? Or oil spills, things like that can damage the habitat and harm the animals, are things that humans can try and do to protect their homes as well. And so hopefully, by doing both of these things of helping to protect and restore their homes, and programs like the Sea Otter Surrogacy Program will work together to help bring back otters. And we now know that when you bring back otters, you're not just bringing back them, you're bringing back entire ecosystems because of the role that they play. By eating those grazers like the sea urchins, it keeps those populations balanced, and it allows for the kelp forest to thrive like you see here. And when a kelp forest is thriving, thousands of animals can thrive as well. All right, my friends, so I want to say thank you so much for joining our program here today. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more, taking a deep dive into the amazing animal that is the sea otter. Because like I said, I hope your takeaway too is that there is much more to them than just a cute face. Why don't we have Tina see if we can put on an otter in the background though, so we can take a look at their cuteness one more time, right? But now you know much more to these animals than just a cute face. They have some amazing adaptations, that huge diet and that fur, right, that help to keep them warm in the cold kelp forest. But we now know that that diet is really important because that's what connects them to those grazers like urchins and other things that would otherwise eat all of the kelp and remove the home, right? But today we also explored ways that we can help as humans and also a really cool program, the Sea Otter Surrogacy Program, that helps to bring back these sea otters as well. So thank you once again, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful time. I had a great time exploring with you. I hope you learned something new. And if you would like, we're going to have another program at 3 where we're going to be learning about some sharks. So thank you, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day, everyone.